Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. A couple of housekeeping notes before we start today. Next week, we will not have a seminar because it's reading break. The week after is Dara Antakabi from MIT, who will be our last speaker of the series. So on behalf of Saman Razavi, I'd like to welcome you all to this seminar and to welcome Sue Brantley from Penn State University. Sue is at Penn State University in the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute, where she is director, and she served as director there for the last 10 or 15 years, I think. Sue has also served as president of the Geochemical Society, is a distinguished professor at Penn State University, and was appointed by President Obama in 2012 as a member of the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. Sue is really a titan in the field of aqueous geochemistry, and especially how this is applied to catchment systems. And she's received too many accolades for me to go into today, but a couple of them I just mentioned. She served as the Pardee Lecturer of the Geological Society of America more than once. She's an elected fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the Geological Society of America. She's an elected fellow of the Geochemical Society. She's a fellow of the European Association of Geochemistry and the International Association of Geochemistry. And most impressively, she was elected in 2012 to the National Academy of Sciences, something that is a very, very rare achievement in American sciences. She's received the Presidential Award from the Soil Science Society of America and has numerous honorary doctorates from European universities, including the University of Lausanne. It's really quite remarkable what Sue has accomplished in her career, with still so much more to go. I view her as really the chief architect of the whole critical zone observatory system that many of you know has flourished in the United States and now has gone global with CZOs in China, throughout Europe. This is really, I think, going to be a lasting legacy for Sue and her career. Today she's going to talk about more the hydrological aspects of her work. Of course, this is only one small slice of her work, as we heard about in class today, but it's a real honor. And again, we thank Howard Weider and the Canada Excellence Research Chair and the Global Institute for hosting Sue's visit. So, Sue.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that nice introduction. This is my first time up here. I've enjoyed it very much, and it's a very impressive place you have here in a beautiful campus setting. I'm going to talk about kind of a big topic here, how water turns rock into soil. And in particular, I'm really going to talk about it from the point of view of not so much soil that we grow our food and our crops on, but all the weathered material that the geologists that we call regoliths. So I'll be really talking about the weathering of rock into regolith. And at the most long time scales, the geological time scales, you can think of Earth as a weathering engine that forces rocks to equilibrate. So rocks are formed at depth, equilibrated at high temperatures and pressures, and then as they move to the surface and are exposed, they then have to equilibrate with Earth's surface conditions, and in particular, they react with the acid gas CO2. So from a very long-term point of view, the CO2 in the atmosphere is actually controlled by how much CO2 is released from volcanoes and how much CO2 is taken up during the weathering of rocks. And this long-term cycle controls CO2 at the long time, and then anthropogenic perturbations of CO2 are what we were thinking about today in terms of climate change. And then there's also the biotic part of the signal, which is a fast timescale as well. So this is kind of the background of what I'm interested in. And I'm going to be talking about a piece of it that is often ignored, and that is that to interact with the water and the CO2, rocks actually have to have a surface area. So when rocks are relatively unfractured, and this is a little bit hard to see, but this is a piece of Stone Mountain where I know Jeff has worked, showing some fracturing. This is, obviously there isn't soil here. And as long as unfractured rock is exposed at the surface, it's very difficult for the water to interact with it. It's very difficult for weathering to occur. Once the fracturings start to increase in frequency, this is now quartz diorite down in Puerto Rico, water can get inside the rock, can interact, and eventually start to form the soil or the saprolite. This is again down in the Puerto Rico watershed. So what I'm going to talk about is that whole process, and I'm a geochemist, I'm interested in weathering processes, but I'm going to talk about it with implications for sort of the hydrologic cycle and the water flow. So I tend to think about this in systems where precipitation is higher than potential evapotranspiration, so we can envision water as being vertically flowing through the rock system, some as being lost to evapotranspiration, but as long as you're at a ridge top, you can sort of convince yourself that in a way this is a one-dimensional problem, and it simplifies how you can think about it. So water flowing downward, and at the very longest time scale, so from a geological point of view again, if you were to stand here at a ridge top and wait long enough, if material was eroding here, and if this regolith or soil, I'm using soil sort of generically here for all the weathered material, if this stayed constant under your feet, if there was some kind of constancy in the thickness of that material, then over long time periods, rock has to come out of the rock part of the diagram and move up through the soil. And as this happened, the particles that would come out would get smaller and smaller due to fracturing and dissolution. And so understanding this part of it, the fracturing and how the rock fragments change over time, is a piece of what I'll be talking about today. And I think it's a really important part that we just don't understand very well. Now, of course, all these processes are influenced by organisms, and so I'll be emphasizing that as well. So I've already kind of told you this in a way. Why would we expect regolith or soil to have any thickness whatsoever if erosion is constantly taking it away from the top of the profile? And that is because we're weathering at the bottom here. And we know that large parts of our planet are covered with regolith, are covered with soil, and that they are very old in some cases, even sometimes at the top of hills or ridge tops. And so to maintain some kind of constant thickness over long periods of time, we actually think that there have to be feeds back. So if erosion speeds up, weathering may speed up because of this feedback. And it's even possible that if weathering increases in rate, that there may be a feedback up to the surface. And so we're going to explore some of those ideas in this talk. I think one of the most important ways that organisms influence these processes are through the oxygen and the CO2 in the soil atmosphere. And so I'll be talking about that as well. And you can see that these are some of the chemical reactions that we'll talk about. Degradation of organic matter, which uses up oxygen, dissolution of silicate minerals, which uses up the acid gas CO2, oxidation of iron oxides, and then oxidation of pyrite, iron sulfide. And geomorphologists are fond of thinking of this kind of a system and suggesting that sort of over long time scales, on average, erosion rates may equal the weathering advance rates, which may explain why regolith can stay a relatively constant thickness over some time frames. And that would be a steady state system then. So what we're trying to figure out, what I'm going to talk to you about today, is how the physical and chemical processes interact to create the regolith or the soil. And I use regolith to mean any weathered material whatsoever, but I'm kind of using soil or regolith interchangeably. There's a lot of arguments about how to define soil, but we'll just use a sort of a generic one. And I like this picture. These are just trying to make you think about these rock fragments that are coming out and moving up through the system. But then there's all the chemistry of those fragments as well. And those changes in the fragment side and in the chemistry of the particles as it moves through this weathering system, soil, those interplays really are what we're trying to understand. And they're totally mediated by biota. They're catalyzed and inhibited by vegetation, by bacteria, by fauna in the soils, and we're trying to understand some of that as well. So I've emphasized the soil and the regolith, but the water we drink is both purified as it moves through soil and through regolith, and it's also stored in the subsurface. And so what I'll be kind of leading towards today is thinking about how we might understand the water as it flows in the subsurface. And I just want to emphasize that at present, we have inadequate models of subsurface water flow precisely because we don't always know what's down there. And we know there's a lot of heterogeneity in the subsurface, and we don't typically have the ability to map it out. And so flow of water in the subsurface is modeled sometimes by just assuming that it's homogeneous, sometimes by assuming that there's a transmissive layer like the saprolite and then underlain by a non-transmissive layer, or sometimes models where flow can be through both of the layers. And we really don't have good ways to a priori decide what the layering should look like. And I think that the geochemistry of weathering may give us some clues toward how to do that, how to come up with those kinds of a priori, pictures or conceptual models in order to make those kinds of more quantitative models. So what I'm going to do as I talk through this is I'm actually going to visit a couple of the different critical zone observatories. And Jeff already mentioned this. This is a program that was started in the United States, but as he said, it's gone international, and now there are critical zone observatories around the world. And these are sites where some of the problems that I'll be talking about today are under active investigation, but really they are sites where we bring together ecologists, soil scientists, hydrologists, geologists, geophysicists, I don't know what I've left out, ecologists, to come together and look at a site together and try to understand all the different pieces of the puzzle so that we can understand these questions that are so coupled between the chemical, physical, and biological. So I'm going to start by going down to Puerto Rico, to the Luquillo Critical Zone Observatory. And I like showing this iconic photo. We work in the Luquillo Mountains in the rainforest of Puerto Rico, and there are huge core stones of granitic material. It's quartz diorite, but in essence, it's a granite. And the streams look like this in some cases. And I like showing this partly because when you look at this, you can tell this is not Pennsylvania, this is not Saskatchewan. And there's clues in this superficial appearance that tells you about all these processes that we want to understand. And yet, what we lack often is the quantitative ability to model them. So we're going to look at the weathering of the quartz diorite in this system. And here is one of those core stones, not quite as big as the one I just showed you, that's forming in situ. So here's the core stone, which is a little bit fractured. And then here's the saprolite above it, and the trees are up here. And surrounding this core stone are fractures that are concentric around the core stone. These are spheroidal fractures. And this process is known, this process of core stone formation where you have these concentric fractures forming around it is known as spheroidal weathering. And it's actually common. It's found on almost every continent, and it's been observed over the full lifespan of the Earth. And we think that this is one of the best examples of sort of the coupling between the fracturing and weathering, and I'll explain to you why. So I'm going to show a lot of figures that are like this. This is a weathering profile from the surface, which you can't quite see up here, down to this zone right here. And these fractures define pieces of rock, which we call rhinelets. And close to the core stone, which is unweathered, the rhinelets are just like rock. They ping with a rock hammer. And as you move outboard, they become more and more weathered, less like the core stone, until they are transformed into the saprolite. So this is really how the weathering is occurring, is right in here, it's fracturing and altering. So this plot shows tau, and I'm showing a lot of tau plots. Tau is really just a normalized concentration for whatever element I'm plotting, and this is sodium and calcium. And to calculate tau, it's all you really have to know is we find an element in the parent rock which is it's in a mineral that's very insoluble. In this case, it's zirconium. And we compare it to the element which is very soluble and which is being depleted from the from the parent rock. And then tau is just a way of normalizing the sodium concentration with the zirconium concentration, so that if tau equals 0, and this doesn't quite get back to 0, but if we plotted a point from here, it would. If it equals 0, then there's been no depletion of sodium compared to zirconium. And if it goes to -1, you've had complete depletion. And so this is really just a depletion profile. And down here, if I had plotted it all the way down, you would see parent composition, and then you're losing your sodium and your calcium, and then at this depth, like 4.5 meters, there's no sodium or calcium left in the material. So what's happening? Well, the most common mineral on the surface of the Earth is feldspar. It's predominantly sodium and calcium aluminum silicate. And so feldspar in this rock is dissolving away across this interface, and then there's no feldspar up here in the saprolite. So there's no feldspar left. This is feldspar rich, no feldspar up here. The reaction is occurring right here in this fractured zone. And you can see as you go across these rhinelets, there's some variability, but here is what I call a reaction front. It's where the reaction is actually occurring. No feldspar, feldspar reaction is actually dissolving the feldspar away. So what we think is happening is the weathering is actually causing the fractures to form. And the process that we think is driving this is oxidation of iron 2 in the quartz diorite, which is actually found in biotite. And this is an image taken on the Stanford synchrotron showing that just in here, close to this last rhinelet, you can see oxidation of the biotite. You see this is Fe3, the intensity of the color, the heat of the color shows you that you've got iron 3 that's starting to form in the biotite, and then you're also losing potassium, which is part of this oxidation reaction. And we believe that this reaction is a volume-enhancing reaction, and that as oxygen diffuses in, causing the biotite to oxidize, it actually swells a little bit until the rock starts fracturing. And this just describes the work that collected these data. So this is what we think is happening. Core stone, oxygen diffusing in, volume expansion. Eventually it builds up to fractures starting to form, and you get these rhinelets. Water then gets down into the rhinelet. The water then starts dissolving the feldspar. If you look at a thin section of the core stone, you see that nothing has changed in here that you can see under scanning microscope. Then you start to see in these channels that you start to get micro cracking as well as these big cracks. And eventually you start to see that there is more and more weathering as you cross this interface. Now, in 1840, a doctor in Rhode Island actually argued for exactly this mechanism. So the mechanism isn't really a new mechanism. It's been seen, as I've said, worldwide, that biotite seems to swell as it oxidizes, and then this can actually crack the rock open. Well, our microbiota involved, and we've dug into the saprolite above this zone and got the proto-rhinelets, where you get a little bit of the unaltered material with the saprolite. And we looked at it with microscopy and DNA extraction and did PCR and sequence analysis. This is with Marianne Bruns, microbiologist at Penn State. Looked at it under various microscopies and related it to the mineralogy. This is some of the microscopic images. The green shows you living cells. So up here in the upper part of the soil where you expect a lot of microbial life, you see green living cells. Down at about 8 feet, so about halfway down, you start to see more dead cells and cellular material. And then there are occasional cells down here, and we did quantify this. So this is a plot of this is a log versus, so this is logarithmic, and this is a linear down 5 meters, showing the number of cells as a function of depth. And this looks like what you might expect. So let's look at total cells, which is the orange here. very high at the surface, decreasing down over the first meter. This has been observed over and over again in soils around the world. And then constant, and then it goes back up very close to this spheroidal weathering interface. Culturable cells in green, same thing. It's very well known that we can't culture most cells, so there's a big difference between total cells and culturable cells, but nonetheless high at the surface, constant, and then increasing at depth. And then you can do a cell count estimated from DNA, and you can sort of see the same thing. So we know that there is a small ecosystem down there of bacterial cells that are growing close to the spheroidal weathering. Turns out that we think that this ecosystem, this microbial ecosystem, is living off the iron oxidation down here at this weathering interface. And you can see the extractable iron is high at the surface in the black, very low, and then increases right down here near the bedrock. In one case, there was a landslide that extracted all the saprolite material, and you could actually see the biofilms at the base of the saprolite that were exposed, and you could actually see the iron coming out, flowing down into the local stream. We can image microbial structures. This is with SEM. You can barely see them in here, but this is published in a paper by Morgan Minyard, and you can see bacteria that we always found on the biotites at the base of this system. And the phylogenetic genetic observations are shown here. Different phyla were observed, and we did indeed find organisms down here that are known to be iron oxidizers. Also, they can be sulfur oxidizers as well. So what we think is going on here, so here's the land surface, here's the rhinelets, here's that unaltered core stone, is up here we have a high microbial density. This is basically dominated by heterotrophic bacteria that are living off of the phototrophic life up here. But then down here, there's very little organic matter left in the water or in the saprolite. And so down here, we think the primary producers, if you want to talk about it that way, are these iron oxidizers that are living off this rock. So it's possible that the microbiota are very much involved. So that was down here in Lucio. I'm now going to go up here, not exactly to Asesio, but very close. I'm going to go to the Piedmont of Virginia. And we're going to look, so we're over here in Virginia. We're going to look at two different rocks and sort of look at the same kind of profiles and talk about what's happening in those particular systems. We're going to look at a diabase, which is a very iron-rich silicate rock, and we're going to look at a granite, which is a less iron-rich silicate rock. And they've both been exposed for more than 100 million years, and they're both eroding at about 6 meters per million years. And so if there's any system that might have reached this mythical geomorphological steady state where the regolith thickness should be constant with time, you would expect it would be these two rocks or rocks that are exposed in this particular setting. And we're going to try to see which has the thickest regolith and then try to understand why. So we did look at the rocks and outcrop. We were able to get into some quarries because, as I said, if one was highly fractured and one was not, you would expect the more highly fractured rock to have weathered more efficiently because the water would have gotten inside it. But what we observed was the fracture density seemed to be about the same, at least as best we could observe it in these quarry walls. We know they both also have very low porosity in the bedrock. The porosity is like 2 or 3%. We can image the pores I think this is transmission electron microscopy with a 0.2 micron scale bar. And the morphology of these pores at 3-grain junctions look very much like what you would expect if the pore network looked like this. So these are, the white are 3 different grains. Here's what we expect very low porosity to look like in systems where the porosity looks like this. In other words, these tubules at the 3-grain junctions and then a few fluid inclusions at 2 grain junctions. So we think that in many ways the two rocks are very, very similar. So which would we expect to have thicker regolith? It turns out that the diabase looks more like this schematic. And here's one of the tau plots that I mentioned I'd show you again. So tau equals 0. This is for, I think it's for feldspar again. So tau equals 0, parent composition, then the feldspar dissolves away, and then there's no feldspar left. And this is at 1 meter. So this is a very thin profile on the diabase. And the reaction front is very thin. It's even thinner than what I just showed you for the quartz diorite. So it's only like 15 centimeters. In contrast, on the granite, it looks more like the picture that I've showed here, where you have a very wide reaction front. You have to go down like 20 meters before you get to the unaltered rock. Over here, we only had to go about 1 or 1.5 meters. And then the plagioclase, the feldspar, dissolves away over about a 10-meter reaction front. So here's parent composition of feldspar, feldspar dissolving away, no feldspar. Here's your reaction front, which is almost 10 meters. So the answer is the granite has thicker regolith. It also has a thicker reaction front. So this is what we've observed, and we think this is important. This is now kind of a schematic. There's sort of two things that I've been emphasizing in these pictures. One is the depth of the regolith, so how far do you have to go down before you hit the unaltered material? And the other is how thick is the zone where the reaction is occurring for whatever mineral you're looking at. And so this is what I call a reaction front, because this is where the reaction is actually occurring. And in the diabase, the thickness of regolith is small. It's a small thickness, and it has a narrow reaction front. And the thickness of the regolith on the granite is much bigger, and it had a wider reaction front. And we think this has to do with the iron content, and I'll explain what I mean. So what's happening in the deep rock? Well, I've actually already told you what's happening in deep rock in some ways. The diabase, when we look at the very deepest material and try to figure out what's going on in the rock, we see very, very small pores that are opening up from dissolution, and it's an iron 2 silicate that's dissolving away. Iron 2 usually oxidizes during weathering and precipitates iron oxide, iron 3 oxide, but we see no precipitation. So porosity is opening with no precipitation, so we know there's no oxygen making it down here. In contrast, the deepest reaction we see on the biotite is oxidation of that biotite, just like in the quartz diorite in Puerto Rico. And again, you probably can't see it here because of the lights, but you can see in the publication fractures that are moving out from the biotite. So biotite oxidation and fracturing that's occurring down there at almost 22 meters. When we look at the porosity in the rock, we can look at the very tiny pores, and I showed you a picture of some of the tiny pores in a TEM image, or we can look at the bigger pores, the micron-sized pores, so I call it nanopores or mesopores. And with the diabase, we do see that these nanopores in the deepest material become connected. So this is the connectivity of those nanopores. And we don't see as much connectivity of these tiny nanopores in the granite down in the unweathered rock, or just incipiently weathered. But in the granite, we do see growth of the bigger pores, the micron-sized pores, and this is right where that biotite oxidation starts. And we can also measure expansion in the rock. This is a calculation, actually, based on the chemistry. And what we do see is that there is dilation, expansion of the rock in the granite down there very close to that onset of biotite oxidation. So on this side of the plot, this is expansion. And then up here, you get some collapse, so some decrease in volume. And in contrast, in the diabase, we see none of that expansion, just like I've been arguing. Then we get a little bit of expansion up here, and then eventually collapse at the top. So really, I'm emphasizing that this oxidation cracks the rocks. And I think that's really important to understand. I don't think we've proven it, but I think there's a lot of good evidence that oxidation tends to be a reaction that causes precipitation, which increases volume and causes cracking to occur. So just to remind you, during the weathering, the water goes down with oxygen and CO2. And you might be wondering, well, this is the more iron-rich rock. Why wouldn't you have expected oxidation to crack the rock over here? And this is what we think. On the iron-rich rock, I think it's very common that the oxygen gets depleted up here in the saprolite, so the oxygen is used up. And so down here in the weathering rock, the deepest reaction is not an oxidation, it's a CO2-driven reaction, so an acid-driven reaction instead of an oxygen-driven reaction. In contrast, and that's what's causing this opening of nanoporosity, because you got dissolution down here causing your opening of some of your nanopores. And then in contrast, on the iron pore granite, the CO2 is actually used up before the oxygen, so the deepest reaction is oxidation. So I think that's really important because I think that oxidation opens up the rock to the water. And in fact, if you look worldwide, my student Katja Basilevskaya pulled together as much data as she could for ridgetop settings on diabase and on granite. This is sort of plotted downward, which is a little bit odd, but this just shows, it's a box and whisker plot, that on average in temperate climates, diabase regolith is kind of around 5 meters in thickness versus 10 meters in thickness for granite. And then in the humid tropics, we actually see even thicker regolith, and putting all the data together. On average, you see that regolith on granitic material, on the iron pore rock, is thicker than on the iron-rich rock. So far I've only been talking about rocks as if there's only one mineral reactant. So I've talked about one reaction front, and I've emphasized either feldspar reacting or biotite, an iron-containing mineral. Actually, there's many minerals in each of these rocks, of course, and they're all dissolving. And so I think that's a really important factor in terms of the hydrology of where the water is and where the water actually can flow. So here's the diabase again. This is a tau plot again, parent composition, reaction front, weathered material up here. Turns out that the multiple minerals that dissolve in the diabase, the multiple abundant minerals, all the reaction fronts lie on top of one another in this very thin zone here. In contrast, in the granitic material, the important reaction fronts separate. So here's that iron 2 in the biotite, that's the oxidation I was telling you about. Here's the feldspar dissolution, which we've also talked about. And then here's the potassium-containing minerals dissolving right up here in the surface. And so one of the pictures I want you to take away is right here, that on some rocks, all the reaction fronts, they don't separate, and on other rocks, the reaction fronts separate. And I think this is important for the following reason for the water flow, is that as the water comes in from the top, when it hits material where there's a big porosity or permeability contrast, in particular permeability contrast, you have a tendency to be able to saturate or perch a water table up here, and then water will flow laterally. And so I think that where these reaction fronts are probably places where porosity change has happened, and more than likely permeability contrasts have been developed. And so at each of these reaction fronts, you have a tendency to have lateral flow if you put enough rain in there and you perch a water table up here. And so I think this is important in terms of being able to see inside a hill or see inside a system and create a conceptual model for the flow. And so we've published a paper where we talk about this. This is just sort of putting this into a sort of a grid scale. Here's the reaction front down here. Here's the reaction front up here. In this kind of granitic system, the iron pore system, I think that you can have water flow up here and water flow down here. And then in this iron-rich rock over here, I think you don't get as much water down here, if any, and you have one location for this lateral flow. All right, well, I've been emphasizing this oxygen-charged water and CO2-charged water going down, and someone out there is thinking, well, the soil atmosphere, the gas in the soil atmosphere is not the same as what we have up here. Microbiota are changing it. And so this is one of the, I think, most important impacts of microbiota, and that is that they change the soil atmosphere. And so we've been putting tubes into the regolith to try to capture soil gas and look at how it changes with depth. And so I'm going to show you some of that data. This is the granite from Virginia, which we've been talking about. We could only get soil gas tubes down 7 meters, so we don't go all the way down to the biotite zone. This is CO2 increasing from whatever it is today, 440 parts per million, getting up to quite high concentrations, so these are almost up to 10%. And here's oxygen, 20% in the atmosphere, going down as a function of depth. And if we plot this, the weight percent O2 versus the weight percent CO2, they pretty much fall in a nice -1 slope shown here. The different shapes are from different depths on the granite, and the different colors are the time of year. This is over a couple years. This is work by Hyojin Kim. And it's remarkable how beautiful the data is. And from a chemical point of view, the reason it falls on a slope of -1 is that that's the stoichiometry of the equation, that the chemical reaction that's controlling it. So this is a shorthand for organic material that's in the soil, oxidizes to produce CO2 and water. This is basically soil respiration. And that's exactly what we're seeing. There is variation, but in general, on the granite, we have aerobic respiration controlling the CO2 and the O2. In contrast, when we go to the diabase, here's O2 versus CO2. Here's that -1 line. This is, some of the data actually do fall on here. That's what we would have expected for aerobic respiration. So if the organisms in there are aerobically respiring, they would have plotted here like on the granite. But actually, as I have been arguing, the oxygen is pulled down. And so we see that there's a totally different slope that much of the data falls on. And so what's going on? Well, instead of oxygen being the electron acceptor, so electrons are taken out of the organic matter by organisms and dropped on oxygen, and that releases energy. That's how they're living. Organisms can actually respire, instead of respiring oxygen, they can respire iron. And so you can put together reactions which actually give you this deeper slope, and that's what's shown down here. So electrons coming out of organic matter being put on either iron 3 or oxygen to produce iron 2 containing minerals such as magnetite. And so this shows that the microbes are actually changing the CO2, O2, which is controlling, impacting the weathering rate at the base of these systems. So this can make a feedback, and this is Hyojin Kim's picture of this. You probably can't read this, so I'll just go through it. In the iron poor rocks, the granitic rock, oxygen gets in, and there's enough fracturing at depth that the oxygen can actually get really deep in the system, so there's a high oxygen availability. Oxidizes the ferrous minerals, it causes fracturing. New conduits are developed for more water and more oxygen. That causes more dissolution, opening up can allow more oxygen, so you get deeper and deeper regolith because it keeps opening. In contrast, there's negative feedbacks on the iron-rich rocks. So some oxygen gets in, but there's low oxygen availability because so much of it is used up high in the system. There's some dissolution of your ferrous minerals at depth, but there's not oxygen, so there isn't the cracking. So there tends to be a little bit of porosity that's created, but there's no fracturing, so there's no advective flow of water, and there's no easy access of oxygen, low supply of oxygen, low availability, and so it's almost like a self-sealing. And so this is essentially explaining why we have the thin regolith versus the thick regolith. And you can see how this is a feedback that's catalyzed by the organisms. Okay, so now I'm going to go to another CZO. I had to remember which one I was going to. I'm going to go to the one where I work in Pennsylvania at Shale Hills. And based on what I just showed you, if you go to a rock that's highly fractured, you would expect lots of advection, lots of access of the oxygen, and so you might expect high separation of the reaction fronts. And so we'll go to this shale. So shale, as you know, is easily fractured. It turns out where I live in Pennsylvania, we're just south of the last glacial maximum, and there's a very high density of fractures in the surface, which is probably related to the periglacial conditions 10,000 years ago. And every borehole we look at, these are televiewer images, so camera images downhole, showing fracture densities, which you can't really see, but in every borehole, we see the upper 8 or 9 meters is highly fractured. So the shale is fractured, just in general, and the upper 8 or 10 meters is fractured. And so we would expect separation of reaction fronts, and that's exactly what we see. This is the diabase, this is the granite. Here's what we have in the shale system. Deepest reaction is pyrite, then we have calcite reacting, and we don't lose our little tiny bit of feldspar and the clay minerals till very high in the system. I can just show you some of this data. This is sulfur content. You can see sulfur in the bedrock, it disappears, and then we have no sulfur, sulfur in the bedrock, it disappears, then we have no sulfur. These are this is the water table, so this is very close to the water table. And if you could see these, this is really nice pyrite framboids, an SEM image, and then this is iron oxide. So deep in the system, we see pyrite, high up, we only see iron oxide. And it's only in the very surface that we start to dissolve the sodium and potassium containing minerals. This is a nice piece of albite, which is feldspar, which is dissolved away, and the illite, which is starting to dissolve. And this is important because, again, I don't know if I mentioned this before, in the very upper parts is usually where the potassium containing minerals are dissolved, and potassium is a very important nutrient. And I think the plants taking up the potassium and returning it back to the soil when they die is another feedback, because it slows down the rate of weathering of that particular mineral and keeps the potassium in that upper part of the system. So here's the stacked reaction fronts for the shale. And again, this picture, I think water comes in, it hits these reaction fronts up here, and a lot of the water can then flow laterally. Some of it makes it all the way down to the water table, and then at the water table it can also flow laterally. So here's a reaction front at the top, reaction front at the bottom, which correlates with this lateral flow. And I guess what I'm arguing is, since we often don't have a good picture for what the subsurface looks like, if we do a couple boreholes and can map out these reaction fronts, it may be a good way to start to try to make models that allow lateral flow to occur where it has occurred in the past. So now what does this look like in 2D? Like, I'm only showing you pictures in one setting, like a borehole setting. If we have two boreholes, we can kind of connect the dots. And this is our picture for Shale Hills. This is that upper fractured zone at the top. And we think that this is interflow, what we call interflow. It's oxygen and CO2 charged. And very little infiltration, but some infiltration makes it all the way down to the water table. And here's the winter water table, and here's the summer water table. So the water table is moving up and down. And it's down here, we have no pyrite, and then we hit pyrite. And we actually see that the pyrite oxidation front is deeper under the valley than it is under the ridge. Of course, I've put borehole data compared to borehole data. I'm just connecting the dots. It would be great if you could see in between. I'm supposed to emphasize, this was just to remind me, I think when these water tables go up and down, they entrain oxygen and CO2 into the water, which can drive the bacterial growth. And pyrite oxidation, I forgot to mention this, is known to be catalyzed by bacteria. And so I think the zone of water table fluctuation is going to be a zone with a lot of bacteria because of this reactive gas entrainment, and it'll catalyze those reactions. So it's almost like a little digester or something. And so it's going to happen up here at this perched water table, and it'll happen down here at what I call the regional or permanent water table. But anyway, if you want to connect between boreholes, one way to do it is with geophysics. And so this is refraction seismic that Nikki West did across one of the sides of the catchment, so essentially like across here, just for example. And what you see is the parent shale that has lost a little pyrite and carbonate, but looks in the seismic like it's unaltered. But then up here we have slower seismic velocities. And so you can actually see this, and I think this is showing you where the heavy fracturing and weathering is occurring. And I can actually plot the velocity of the seismic wave. I didn't plot this, Nikki West plotted it. This is the velocity of this seismic is constant up here, and then it slows down. And now this is a tau plot for potassium. So this is parent composition, and then you're losing potassium. And you can see it's very variable. This is shale, so there's some compositional variation. But you can see that the seismic really doesn't look that bad compared to the weathering of the illite. And this is weathering of magnesium, so same idea. Now the seismic is undoubtedly showing not only the weathering, but also the fracturing up here in the surface. So this is the conceptual model. I think that water is coming in from the top. I think in these systems where you get separation of reaction fronts, there's a high likelihood that you have permeability contrast and can have interflow high in the system. And then some of the water will infiltrate to the bottom, and you'll lose water as sort of regional groundwater flow. Importantly, the reactions up here, I think, often contain potassium, which is a really important nutrient. And I think that there's feedbacks up there that keep the potassium up there and slow down the reactions of those minerals in that zone. And down here is where you lose your most soluble minerals because they react first. And up here is where you lose your more moderately soluble minerals. Okay, so the last critical zone observatory I'm going to take you to, and I really don't have much time to do this, is down here in Calhoun. It's still on the Piedmont. This is in South Carolina. And this has very deep regolith. So it's a beautiful data from Alan Bacon and Dan Richter. These are 4 different tau plots: sodium, calcium, potassium, magnesium. For some reason, you can't see, there's some shading on here, but parent composition, this is plotted the same way. Parent composition, sodium is in feldspar again, and you can see here's the reaction front. It starts at about 35 meters. You start losing feldspar, and it's sodium, calcium containing feldspar. So here's that reaction front, very wide reaction front. So it's actually really similar to Virginia. And then you lose a little bit of potassium down here. It turns out this is where biotite starts to oxidize. And most of the potassium minerals are lost up here in the top zone. So I would argue that this is a zone up here where interflow would be expected, and then a deeper flow zone down here, perhaps. And once again, they did seismic here. And this is that same tau plot. So the symbols here, this is depth, and this is parent composition. This is loss of the feldspar, and then there's no feldspar in the upper 18 meters or so. And then on top of it is the seismic data, which is the green line, like either green or black line. I'm sorry, they're almost on top of each other. So these 2 lines are the seismic data. So this is the P wave velocity in the rock that Steve Holbrook measured, Steve from University of Wyoming. And you can see that you get you have nice, fast seismic waves down in the unaltered rock, 4 kilometers a second, and then it starts deviating right where the plagioclase starts to dissolve. So, I mean, it's kind of a beautiful example where we can overlay the geophysics with the geochemistry, and it makes a lot of sense. And then we can take that seismic and extrapolate from one borehole using this kind of data. I'm not going to talk about this. This is the gamma, the neutron probe, and it actually shows where oxidation starts, and it does match where the biotite oxidation occurs. Well, you can send down a televiewer. This is just a camera that you put down into the borehole and look and see what the rock looks like. This is not this borehole, so I'm cheating a little bit. This is from Steve Holbrook from University of Wyoming. This is the Wyoming Sherman granite. But this is actually a very common thing to observe in granites, that down here you get this beautiful granitic material, and then at the depth that biotite starts oxidizing and the feldspar starts weathering, it gets all chewed up. And so you can kind of see some unaltered material, you can see granulated material, fractured material. And if you go into the Piedmont of the east coast of the United States, where lots and lots of water wells have been drilled, this is the zone that the drillers are aiming for, because this is a very transmissive zone. And this is right in here, in this zone right here. And I think it's where there's a high water flow, lateral flow, I think oxygen is getting down to this depth. The oxygen is allowing biotite oxidation, and I think that it's allowing ecosystems to grow, microbial ecosystems that actually help to chew up the rock. And this is a little bit more confusing plot, but I threw it in here because I'm excited about this. This is some of our newest data. This is still Calhoun. This is the same data I'm showing you. We haven't published this data, so it doesn't look as pretty yet, but here's parent composition. This is actually when we cross into different rocks, so you can ignore this. That's why it's plotted differently. There's a different composition down here, but here's the biotite oxidation right there. So that's where the biotite gets oxidized. The potassium feldspar doesn't disappear to the top, so this is kind of like a review for everything I told you before. The feldspar, the sodium feldspar, weathering front, I've already showed you all that. But now there's two new things here, namely calcite, which is in the blue. We get a little increase in calcite right there where the feldspar starts to dissolve and the biotite starts oxidizing. And we get a little increase of sulfur, and then it decreases. So the calcite, we always have calcite, and then we get an increase, and then it dissolves away. And the same with the sulfur, a little increase, and then it dissolves away. So the dissolving away part, we understand. Sulfur increases at the top because sulfur comes in from the rain and it gets taken up by the organic matter. So any pyrite, which is in the granite, there's usually a little bit of pyrite in granite, gets oxidized up here, but then you see the sulfur going back up just because of atmospheric deposition. But what I'm excited about is this little bump in the calcite and the sulfur. This is something that we've seen before. I could have showed you this with the Virginia data too, but I didn't. I thought I'd be going too long, which I am a little bit. I think what happens is right down here, when the feldspar starts dissolving away, if you're running out of CO2, which I've been arguing, as the CO2 gets drawn down, the pH goes up, you'll produce calcite. And I think this is sort of like the bottom of the microbial activity, so to speak. I think this little calcite precipitation is telling you when you don't have enough bacteria down there producing CO2, and so you're losing those sort of aerobic organisms. And then I think this little bit of sulfur peak is what we see. The sulfur is present is in organic matter, and I think you're just these little mineralogical signals are showing you sort of where the bacterial influence ends. And so I think that's kind of cool because it's a mineralogical evidence. And there's other people around the world that are thinking like this, actually with much deeper rocks. So in Sweden, they're doing some beautiful work. Henrik Drake is doing some beautiful work on some of the granites where they're hoping to bury their nuclear waste. And they're looking at fractures deep in the granite. And what they're finding is mineralogical evidence in the form of calcite and some pyrite, mineralogical evidence and then isotopic evidence that suggests that deep in this granite, there's methanogenesis going on, methane oxidation, and sulfate reduction, so that there is a small ecosystem that lives down there that leaves behind a mineralogical signal. So we're going to try to keep figuring that out in terms of this system as well. All right, so I'm basically done. I've tried to argue that, as weathering occurs and erosion occurs, water comes in from the top, but over geologic time, the rock material comes up and moves out of the system. And as it comes up, it goes through this zone of saturated unweathered rock. And eventually, right in here at this sort of regional water table, the most soluble minerals dissolve, the calcite and the pyrite as an example. And then as it moves through this higher zone, the sort of moderately soluble minerals dissolve. And then at the very top, the non-soluble minerals are removed by erosion. And I think this kind of a picture can help us think about what's inside a hill when we're trying to understand what the different layers look like. I think if steady state is true, if the regolith stays constant with time, we can actually use arguments about the relative abundance of minerals and their solubilities to predict what the partitioning of flow could be. So if it is operating as a steady state, we can actually calculate what the flow, the inner flow is, and what the groundwater flow is. And we can think about what controls the separation between inner flow and groundwater flow. And I've given you a bunch of different examples. I'm not going to go through them now. But 3 of these, I think, are mediated by organisms. And so I think, what I've been trying to argue is that there's this permeability structure that develops inside of a hill. And I think steady state probably doesn't obtain everywhere. It's probably not true everywhere. But I think systems typically are moving back to steady state at any given time often because of the interaction of the feedbacks that are related to some of these biological processes. And this is what I think we need to work harder to understand. So this is my conclusion slide. I showed you how rocks crack, dissolve, and then reform new minerals. I didn't actually talk about this, but we know that cracks start forming very deep, down around 2 kilometers. This is totally inorganic. We know, based on the work in Sweden that I mentioned right at the end, that there are microbes that are living quite deep, down in, 1 kilometer, even maybe 2 kilometers, in the faults, not the faults, the fractures. At shallower depths, we start to see minerals dissolving that I've talked to you about. And then we see these reaction fronts, and I think these reaction fronts act like valves, where the water comes in vertically and then can move laterally. I've really emphasized oxygen. I think it's like what cracks open the rocks. And I think this is particularly important on granitic rocks. And I think if we understood this better, I think we'd be able to have good conceptual models for the quantitative predictions that we want to be able to make. All this funding is funded by Department of Energy and National Science Foundation, and I have slews of co-authors that have worked with me, and I tried to mention some of them today. So thank you for your attention.
Okay, thanks, Sue. We have time for a couple of questions. And I'm looking also to the students that didn't have a chance to ask a question in class today. Maybe I'll kick off with a question as people are thinking. Oh, there's a question here.
I'm obviously not a student, but I would like to thank Dr. Brantley for the great soil genesis 877. I can't say that I understood all of it, but I got some idea of what happens in that kind of environment. I'd like to thank the Global Institute of Water Security for making this series of lectures available, and particularly for making them so that old fossils like me can sit on my 27-inch iMac at home and see it. And I've done that with some of them, particularly the Professor Monterani from the world's oldest university in Italy. And what he basically said is that modeling doesn't work unless you've got the whole animal, and that we need to interact with society. And my question for Dr. Brantley has to do with the Critical Zone Observatory. I have had contact for the last decade almost with your colleague Henry Lind in Penn State, and he's widely considered the father of hydropodology. And I think that's the biggest thing that happened to soil science since it began. We have to think deeper. We're sitting here on about 50 meters of glacial material over top of the bedrock, and within that are many aquifers that make things happen. So I think we need to be, and we need to know what the stratigraphy is, and in this area that's all been worked out, but I don't think it's been utilized, and society isn't benefiting. And we have a laboratory a few miles east of here in the St. Denis wildlife area that has resulted in many very good studies and many papers published that are snapshots of moving pictures and eyeballs of elephants. And I think we have to start looking at the whole elephant. And the whole elephant in this case is the Minicinus Hills. And I think the Minicinus Hills should be a critical zone observatory. And I presented that, presented to Jeff and colleagues, and was dismissed and said, why would we want to do that? What can we do for you? I've built my empires. It's for the next generation to do it. So I'd like to know your opinion. Why can we not have a critical zone observatory in Canada centered on St. Denis, with the elephant being the Minicinus Hills upland, and the applicability of that is the whole pothole region. We don't have dendritic drainage. Our landscape has to absorb everything in potholes that farmers call sloughs and people call ponds. In the St. Denis Wildlife Area, there's a Bond 109 that's had many papers published. One that says the flow is all vertical, and the other says the flow is all horizontal. And they're both right. One was done in the middle of a drought period, and the other was done in a period of very wet years. And the controlling factor is the glacial aquifer that took how many papers before even anybody recognized it was there, and it's never been documented. So my question is, why can't we have a global critical zone observatory here? And I think we need to start looking at the elephant and quit picking away at the eyeballs.
Okay, well, thank you for that comment. Let me agree with you on two major things, because you said a lot of different things. First, Henry Lynn's work on hydropedology has been wonderful, and Henry Lynn is part of the Critical Zone Observatory at Penn State, and I've learned a lot from him. And second, I think it'd be great to have a Critical Zone Observatory up here at Penn State, in Canada, sorry. I didn't quite hear where you wanted it, but I would be wholeheartedly in favor of your having a CZO wherever you want it up here. I know they've started CZOs in Australia, in China, Germany, France. I mean, the idea that we have to look at all the different parts of the system at the same time, it's attractive because it's what we need to look at some of these problems. So I'd be very much in favor of wherever it was you were suggesting you should have one up here, but I couldn't quite hear.
Just take someone to write a proposal, get $5 million from the National Science Foundation.
Oh, and I wouldn't be in favor of you getting money from the U.S. because we don't have enough of it right now.
Other questions?
But it'd be great
comments?
to have Canadian money.
Maybe a quick question for me. We're a bit past time. But
I know, I talked too long.
The comment about the iron-rich rocks, the oxygen's used up, the water table stays high. I guess it's kind of a chicken and egg question, maybe, and we talked about this a bit today. So that's a situation maybe where the permeability of the rock is low. So I guess, what's driving what? If you had maybe a more permeable material, regardless of the chemistry, then you might have more of an oxygenated zone. The water table is going up and down. This also relates to the seasonality of the system, maybe. And I'm guessing, I'm wondering how you separate those factors.
Well, I don't really know how to separate them. I mean, the whole chicken and egg thing is the whole problem. It's even more complicated than that in some ways, because if you talk to Stan Buell from North Carolina State, who looked at deep regolith, he argues that the reason you have thinner regolith on diabase and iron-rich rock is because you form smectites that are expanding clays and that occlude the porosity from the top down. So he would argue it's a top-down thing, and I'm arguing that it's sort of a bottom-up thing. Probably both are correct. So it's very difficult to sort of separate these. That's why we need more critical zone observatories, especially in Canada.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time. Maybe one last question, and then we'll wrap up and head to the bar.
I'm sorry I spoke too long.
Yeah.
I thank you for the nice talk. So my question is more regarding the time scale of these reactions that are happening and their implications for the water cycle we normally tend to see in the hydrological model. So if I want to be specific, so my question is, what is a permeability that we can use in our soil layer in a hydrologic model that we would consider constant over, 1 year, 2 years? What is the time scale that this permeability is changing that we need to be cautious about when using our models? You see my point? After 10 years, I should come back and say, now this soil has changed permeability. We need to revise it.
So you're asking me how fast can the permeability change? Well, I think that in terms of these reaction fronts, we're talking about hundreds to thousands of years. But of course, as you know, you can also move particles around. You can move clay around. And so there are processes that can change permeability really fast from a physical point of view as well. But in terms of the chemistry of the reaction, I think talking about hundreds of thousands of years to sort of move these reaction fronts or start to create these reaction fronts. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
I think the key point is you're seeing a conceptual model of the plumbing of the system. And I think that's the most important connection to hydrological modeling. Usually the model is the most ad hoc part of the structure.
Yeah.
You're using geochemistry to say what are the dominant flow paths, and that could be then wired into the model structure, which I think opens up a really important new dialogue.
Yeah, and over what time was mainly my question, like these processes interact over what time more effectively, Is it a year, a day, 1 hour, or like decades?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Good.
And I think the CZOs, one of the things that's happening is the hydrologists are talking to the geochemists, and that really moves you forward. And I'm talking to Henry Lynn at Penn State and learning about hydropedagogy, and that's what we really need to have happen.
Yeah. All right, so thank you again, Sue. We really enjoyed your talk, and if anyone wants to continue the discussion, a bunch of us will be going into Alexander's momentarily. Thanks.
Thank you.